The fog in Grey Hollow was less a weather phenomenon and more a state of being, a perpetual hush that muffled the world and pressed down on the worn cobblestones of the old town square. Ethan Cole, his 35 years etched with the fatigue of too many late nights chasing headlines, felt it cling to his jacket, a cold, damp embrace that offered no comfort. He had returned to this place, this forgotten corner of Massachusetts, not by choice, but by the insistent, chilling grip of necessity. His mother was gone, just like that. Her death, abrupt and inexplicable, had yanked him from the kinetic chaos of city life back to the spectral quiet of his childhood home. The official cause, a sudden cardiac arrest, felt like a flimsy veil over something far more sinister, something whispered in hushed tones amongst the town's dwindling elderly population. He, the hardened investigative reporter, the staunch atheist, scoffed at their superstitions, yet a knot of unease tightened in his gut.
It was the bell, they said. Always the bell. His rental car coughed, rattling over a pothole as he navigated the narrow, winding lanes. Old elms, skeletal and shrouded, loomed on either side, their branches dripping with condensed mist. Every house looked the same: gabled roofs, faded paint, windows like unseeing eyes peering from behind lace curtains. Grey Hollow, a name perfectly suited to its temperament, a town perpetually in twilight, where history wasn't just remembered, but felt, a palpable presence. At the heart of it all, dominating the skyline like a sentinel carved from granite, stood St. Bellum. Its rough-hewn stone facade, darkened by centuries of damp, rose majestically above the surrounding buildings. The church, built in the 18th century, was an anachronism, a defiant monument to a fading faith. Its bell tower, a slender spire that pierced the low-hanging clouds, was impossibly tall, a testament to the ambitions of its long-dead masons.
But the bell, Ethan knew, was silent. A chill, sharper than the fog, traced its way up his spine as he parked near the cemetery gates directly opposite the church. He stared at the tower, its upper reaches swallowed by the gloom. 40 years ago, a mysterious accident had silenced its voice, severing the ropes, sealing the mechanism. The official story was a structural failure during a storm, but Grey Hollow had its own narrative, one woven from fear and folklore. If you hear the St. Bellum bell when there is no service, the old wives' tales began, their voices raspy with age and dread. Then God does not call, death calls. His mother, bless her practical, no-nonsense soul, had dismissed it for years, until last week, until she called him, her voice a thin, reedy whisper, barely audible above the static. She'd heard it. At 2:18 a.m., she'd insisted, clear as day. The very next morning, she was gone. Ethan scoffed aloud, the sound swallowed by the pervasive silence.
Collective psychological trauma, he reasoned. The power of suggestion, magnified by generations of isolation and dread. People died. It was the one certainty of life. Their minds, seeking patterns, latched on to convenient coincidences, weaving them into elaborate, comforting, or terrifying myths. He, a man of facts and reason, would pull back the curtain on this particular charade. He stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under his worn boots, the sound shockingly loud in the oppressive quiet. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a smell that spoke of time's relentless passage. His mother's house was a few blocks away, awaiting his grim duties, but something pulled him towards St. Bellum first.
a magnet of morbid curiosity, perhaps, or a nascent, unacknowledged need to confront the source of the town's collective delusion. The church doors were massive, oak, banded with rusted iron. They were unlocked.
Inside, the air was colder, thick with the scent of old incense and dust. Stained glass windows depicting saints in various states of beatitude and martyrdom glowed dully, their vibrant colors muted by the perpetual gloom outside. Pews, dark and polished, stretched into the nave, empty save for a scattering of forgotten hymnals. He walked slowly, his footsteps etching into cavernous space. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere in the distant darkness, a counterpoint to the thrum of his own pulse. This was where his mother had found solace, or perhaps where she had ultimately been consumed by her fears. The idea stung him, a reporter's objectivity warring with a son's grief. A figure stirred in the flickering candlelight of a side chapel. Small, hunched, and draped in a faded habit, it was Sir Marguerite, the last nun of St. Bellum.
He recognized her instantly, though her face, when she turned slightly, was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes like chipped ember, ancient and knowing. She'd been a fixture of his childhood, a silent, watchful presence. She was said to become struck mute in 1979, the same year of the Bell accident. She didn't speak, of course. She simply watched him, her gaze unwavering, impossibly deep. There was fear in those eyes, a profound, unshakable dread that seemed to emanate from the very depths of her being. She held a worn rosary in garnered fingers, her thumb stroking the beads with a repetitive, almost frantic motion. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to speak to her, to ask her about his mother, about the bell, about everything, but he knew it would be futile. He gestured vaguely towards the bell tower, a silent question. Sir Margaret's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and she shook her head, a slow, deliberate movement that conveyed a chilling, absolute refusal. Then her gaze dropped to her trembling hands, and she resumed her silent prayer, her lips moving in a soundless supplication. It was a clear dismissal, a warning. Ethan remained for a moment, absorbing the weight of her silence, the oppressive history of the place. He felt a prickle on his skin, not of cold, but of something unseen, something ancient stirring in the shadows. He'd come to Grey Hollow to dispel a myth, to debunk a ludicrous superstition. But in the presence of Sir Margaret's palpable fear, in the hollow echo of the church, his unwavering certainty began to fray, just a little. He turned, leaving the nun to her vigil, and walked back towards the main doors. The weight of the church, its history and its dread, seemed to settle on his shoulders. He was here to investigate, to find truth, to honor his mother's memory by proving her final moments were not a premonition of death, but merely the unfortunate culmination of a life.
But as he stepped back into the persistent fog of Grey Hollow, a new thought, cold and unwelcome, burrowed into his mind. What if his mother hadn't died from a heart attack at all? What if something else, something far older and more sinister, had truly called her name? And what if, just what if, he was next in line to hear its resonant, deadly summons? The town's pervasive whisper had found its way under his skin. The chill intensified, burrowing deep, past his clothes, past his flesh, right into the marrow of his bones. He looked back at the bell tower,
its top still obscured, a dark phantom against the gray sky. He refused to believe it. He had to. He was Ethan Cole, a man of logic. Yet a part of him, a small, terrified part, wondered what exactly he was up against in this town where even God's silence seemed to hold a terrifying power.
He adjusted his jacket, pulled his collar higher, and headed towards his mother's empty house, the ghost of a bell's chime already ringing faintly in the recesses of his imagination. He had 7 days, he thought, to disprove a ghost story, or perhaps to understand his own mortality. His mother's house was a time capsule, each object a silent testament to a life lived without him for so many years. The scent of lavender potpourri, her favorite, mingled with the faint, metallic tang of cold, empty air. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through the drawn blinds, pirouetting through the solemn silence. He walked from room to room, his footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floors, each sound amplifying the hollow ache in his chest. A photograph on the mantelpiece showed her, younger, smiling, her eyes bright with a joy he hadn't seen in her in years. He picked it up, tracing the outline of her face, the paper cool beneath his thumb.
He set photo down gently, a silent promise forming in his mind. He would find answers. This wasn't just about debunking a superstitious myth. It was about honoring her, understanding her final days, and perhaps forgiving himself for being so far away. His mother had been a meticulous woman, and he knew her study would be the logical starting point. It was a small room filled with books, journals, and the faint smell of aged paper. He ran a hand over the spines of her favorite novels, a strange comfort in their familiar presence. On her writing desk, beneath a stack of unpaid bills, he found it, a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his mother's elegant cursive handwriting. He hesitated, a fleeting sense of intrusion warring with his journalistic impulse. This was personal, private, but her death had made it public, at least to him. He opened it, his eyes scanning the first few entries, mundane observations about garden plants and local gossip.
Then the tone shifted. November 12th, an entry read, dated just 3 weeks prior. Another foggy night. Heard Mrs. Henderson say old Mr. Abernathy heard it again at 2:19 a.m. He'd been ailing, of course, but the way she said it. The entries grew more frequent, more agitated. November 20th, sleepless. The wind sounds like a chime, or is it my imagination running wild? And then the final chilling entry, dated the night she died, December 1st. It wasn't the wind. It was real. 2:19 a.m., clear as day. God forgive me. A cold wave washed over him, not of fear, but of profound sadness. His mother, strong and rational, had succumbed to the town's collective psychosis. Or had she? He wanted to believe it, to dismiss her final words as the ravings of a mind weakened by age and illness, a self-fulfilling prophecy brought on by fear. But the raw terror in her handwriting was undeniable. He closed the journal, placing it carefully back on the desk.
He needed hard facts, not fragmented fears. His next stop was the Gray Hollow Public Library, a small, unassuming building that smelled of old books and dust. Mrs. Gable, the ancient librarian with spectacles perched on her nose, recognized him immediately. "Ethan Cole, dear. Back for your mother's affairs, I presume. A terrible shock, truly." Her voice was a fragile whisper, like dried leaves skittering across pavement. "Yes, Mrs. Gable," he replied, forcing a smile. "Just tying up loose ends. I was also hoping to look through some old town records, maybe some newspaper archives. My mother always loved history." She eyed him with an unnerving knowingness.
Ah, yes, Grey Hollow's history. Plenty of that to go around. What exactly are you looking for, dear? Anything about the St. Bellum Church, particularly around the late 70s. The bell tower accident, perhaps. He tried to sound casual, but his voice was tighter than he intended.
Gabor's thin lips pressed into a tight line. That old business, best left undisturbed, I always say. But she pointed him towards a shelf of bound newspapers and a dusty tome titled A Chronology of Grey Hollow. Page 117 might interest you, she added, her voice barely audible. He pulled the heavy book from the shelf, its pages brittle and yellowed. He found page 117. It detailed the construction of St. Bellum, the prominent families who funded it, and then a chilling passage. The great bell, named Mortis Dei, the death of God, was cast in 1782. He paused, his breath catching. Mortis Dei. A shiver crawled down his spine. No wonder the town feared it. The book went on to describe its unusual composition, a special alloy, but gave no further details. He then delved into the newspaper archives. It took him an hour, but he found it, a front-page article from October 1979. St. Bellum priest found dead in bell tower, apparent suicide.
The article detailed the death of Cha Thomas Reed, the beloved parish priest, found hanged in the bell tower. It mentioned structural damage to the tower during a particularly violent storm that same night, leading to the bell being sealed. No mention of a bell ringing, no mysterious deaths, just a tragic suicide and a damaged church. But a small, almost imperceptible detail caught his eye. A subheadline, barely visible, buried beneath the main text. Witnesses report strange chimes. The article quickly dismissed it as mass hysteria, a psychological response to the shock of the priest's death. He cross-referenced the date, October 27th, 1979, the same year Sir Margaret lost her voice. The pieces were starting to coalesce, forming a disturbing, if still illogical, picture. He felt the familiar rush of the chase, the adrenaline of an investigation taking hold. This wasn't just a quaint town legend. There was a pattern, a recurring narrative that defied simple dismissal.
His logical brain still insisted on explanations, on facts, on hard evidence. But the spectral quiet of Grey Hollow, the ancient, fearful eyes of Sir Margaret, and now the morbid name of the bell, Mortis Dei, were chipping away at his rational facade. He had 5 days left until his mother's funeral, 5 days to unravel a 40-year-old mystery, 5 days before he might be tempted to listen for the chime himself. The thought sent a cold tendril of dread through him. He packed up his notes, feeling the weight of the town's secrets settling upon him like the perpetual fog. The investigation had truly begun. The next morning, the fog seemed to have thickened, pressing against the windows of his mother's house like a silent, demanding presence. Ethan woke with the lingering echo of Cha Thomas Reed's name in his mind, the memory of the archived article a persistent hum. Suicide, a clean, tragic explanation.
Yet, the reported strange chimes, Sir Margaret's sudden muteness, painted a far more unsettling picture. He needed to speak to someone, anyone, who had lived through 1979 in Grey Hollow, someone who remembered more than just the official narrative. His thoughts immediately turned to the town's oldest residents, the ones who gathered at the general store, their faces etched with the tales of decades past. He found old Mr. Abernathy, mentioned in his mother's journal,
hunched over a cup of lukewarm coffee, his eyes rheumy but sharp. Abernathy had been a spry 60-year-old in 79. Now he was nearly a century old, a living repository of Grey Hollow's forgotten fears. "Mr. Abernathy," Ethan began, pulling up a creaky chair opposite him. "I'm Ethan Cole, Sarah Cole's son. I'm investigating a few things about the church, specifically the bell tower accident in 79. Abernathy's cup rattled in its saucer. He looked around nervously, as if the very walls had ears. "Ah, the bell."
Best not to speak of it, young man. Some things are better left quiet. His voice was a dry rustle, like autumn leaves across pavement. My mother heard the bell just before she died. Ethan pressed gently, watching the old man's reaction. The words hung in the air, a stark declaration. Abernathy flinched, his eyes darting to the window, then back to Ethan. Sarah, bless her soul, a good woman, but she shouldn't have listened. He sighed, a long, mournful sound. It was a night like any other back then, storm brewing. Everyone knew Cha Thomas was troubled, spent too much time in that tower, said he heard things. Heard what? Ethan leaned forward, his journalistic instincts tingling. Whispers, accusations. He'd come down, pale as a ghost, muttering about sinners and judgment. We thought he was losing his mind. But then, the night he died, the storm was fierce, wind howling like a banshee. But then, above it all, a sound so clear, so profound, it cut through the wind and the rain. Abernathy paused, his gaze distant, lost in the past. The bell. We all heard it. Not just the chime, no, a long, mournful toll. 3 times, from 2:17 to 2:20. Exactly. Everyone in town heard it. Even Mrs. Gable. She lived furthest out. We knew then. It wasn't the storm that broke the ropes. It was the bell itself, announcing something terrible. But the newspapers said it was a suicide, Ethan interjected, trying to ground the narrative in reality. The newspapers, Abernathy scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. They don't know Grey Hollow. They never have. Chad Thomas didn't just hang himself. He was judged. The bell rang for him. And that night, it wasn't just silent afterward. It bled. Ethan felt a jolt. Bled? Yes, from the inside. The next morning, when they finally got the doors open, there was a dark, reddish stain on the stone floor beneath the bell, like dried blood.
No one could explain it. They sealed the tower, said it was a structural hazard, but we knew. That's why Sir Margaret lost her voice. She was up there, near the tower, that night. Saw something, heard something, and it broke her. Abernathy shivered, even though the store was warm. Mortis Dei, it's what Cha Thomas called it, the death of God. Not just a name, a warning. Ethan thanked the old man, his mind reeling. Mortis Dei, bled. This wasn't just a psychological phenomenon. This was something darker, something steeped in a different kind of reality. He remembered Sir Margaret's fear, her unwavering gaze. She was the key. He returned to St. Bellum. The church was as cold and silent as before. He found Sir Margaret in the same side chapel, her back to him, her shoulders slumped in prayer. He approached her slowly, his shadow falling across the worn stone floor. She stiffened, but didn't turn. He pulled out his notebook and a pen.
On a fresh page, he wrote, Sir Margaret, Cha Thomas Reed.
Human bones, the alloy mentioned in the book, a bell cast from the remains of the unabsolved. It wasn't just a metaphor. This wasn't just fear. This was blasphemy, a sacrilege, and a profound, terrifying explanation for the bell's true, sinister purpose. His atheism, usually a comforting shield, felt suddenly inadequate, flimsy against this ancient, horrifying revelation.
He looked at Sir Margaret, her face pale, her eyes wide with unspeakable dread. She had confirmed everything. The bell wasn't merely a superstition, it was a cosmic ledger, marking the souls of those beyond earthly absolution, and his mother, Sarah Cole, had been one of them. What had she done? He felt a desperate urgency, a need to uncover her secret, not just for his journalistic quest, but for a son's desperate desire to understand, and perhaps to forgive. The fog outside seemed to press in, thick and suffocating, mirroring the dread that now twisted in his gut. His logical mind was screaming, but a deeper, primal part of him was starting to believe. The revelation about Mortis Dei, the bell cast from the bones of the unconfessed, left Ethan reeling. His journalistic skepticism, usually an impenetrable fortress, had been breached. The sheer audacity of the claim, combined with Sir Margaret's terrified conviction, made it impossible to dismiss outright.
He felt a chilling certainty that he was no longer merely chasing a story, but confronting a terrifying truth. His mother's journal, her final, frantic entry, now pulsed with a new, terrifying meaning. God forgive me. What unspoken sin had she carried to her grave? He spent the rest of the day holed up in his mother's study, surrounded by her life, trying to piece together the fragments of a past he barely knew. He went through old letters, photo albums, and legal documents. He was searching for anything, a hint, a whisper of a transgression that would fit Sir Margaret's chilling criteria. Those who caused death and never truly atoned. His mother had always been a moral, upright woman, a pillar of the community in her quiet way. The idea of her harboring such a profound sin was almost unthinkable. Yet, the bell had rung for her. As evening bled into night, the familiar grey hollow fog began its nightly descent, wrapping the house in a damp, silent shroud. The air grew heavy, pregnant with unspoken secrets. Ethan felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling sensation on his skin, as if unseen eyes were watching him. He pushed through it, fueled by a grim determination. He found it in an old shoebox, tucked away beneath a pile of dried flowers and forgotten trinkets in the attic. A faded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, dated nearly 20 years ago. The headline, stark and bold, read, "Tragic accident claims life of young hiker." Below it, a grainy photo of a smiling teenager, a boy with bright, innocent eyes. The article described how a local boy, 16-year-old Daniel Miller, had gone hiking in the nearby woods and fallen from a precarious cliff edge, his body discovered days later. A tragic accident, ruled the police. But a smaller, almost hidden paragraph at the bottom caught his eye. It mentioned a minor detail. A witness reported seeing a car parked near the trailhead, but authorities found no evidence of foul play or a connection to the incident. The car, described vaguely as a dark sedan, had been noted by a passing hunter. Ethan's heart began to pound. His mother owned a dark sedan at the time. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He remembered that period. His mother had been unusually withdrawn, distant, suffering from what she called a bout of nerves. He dismissed it as grief for his recently deceased father. But now, a colder, more terrifying explanation presented itself. He turned the clipping over. On the back, in his mother's distinctive hand, was a single cryptic note. "Forgive me, Daniel. Forgive me." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Not a direct killing, no, but causing death and never truly atoned. Had his mother been there? Had she seen something?
Had she somehow, perhaps inadvertently, contributed to Daniel Miller's fall? And had she, for 20 long years, buried the truth, allowing an innocent death to be labeled an accident to protect herself, her reputation, her peace of mind? The thought sickened him. His mother, a person he believed he knew intimately, was suddenly a stranger, shrouded in a web of deceit and unspoken guilt. The bell, Mortis Dei, now made a terrifying, undeniable sense. It wasn't a random curse, it was a cosmic reckoning, calling out those who had evaded earthly justice, whose consciences remained stained. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to confront Sir Margaret again, to verify his horrifying suspicion. He needed to know if his interpretation was correct, if this hidden sin was indeed the one that had condemned his mother. The silence of the house was oppressive, pressing down on him, amplifying his frantic thoughts.
He grabbed his jacket, the old newspaper clipping clutched in his hand, and stepped out into the impenetrable fog. The familiar path to St. Bellum felt different now, charged with a sinister energy. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a whispered accusation. The air grew colder, biting at his exposed skin. He reached the church, a spectral monolith in the shifting mists. The doors, usually unlocked, were now firmly shut. He pushed against them, but they wouldn't budge. A surge of frustration mixed with a chilling dread washed over him. He pounded on the heavy oak, his knuckles aching with the effort. No response. He circled the church, searching for another entrance, a flicker of light, anything. He found a small, unmarked side door, almost hidden by overgrown ivy. It was unlocked. He slipped inside, the air immediately growing colder, heavier. The church was darker than before, the few candles from earlier extinguished.
Only a sliver of moonlight, diffused by the thick fog, managed to pierce the stained glass windows, casting faint, ethereal patterns on the floor. He called out Sir Margaret's name, his voice swallowed by the vast, echoing space. No answer. He made his way to the side chapel where he had last seen her. It was empty. A sense of profound isolation descended upon him. He was alone in the ancient, chilling edifice, surrounded by the ghosts of Grey Hollow's past. He felt a profound sense of foreboding, a certainty that something had shifted, that the rules of his investigation had subtly changed. Then he saw it. On the small altar in the chapel, where Sir Margaret often prayed, was a fresh sheet of paper, held down by her worn rosary. His heart hammered against his ribs. He approached it, his steps hesitant, his breath shallow. On the paper, in Sir Margaret's unmistakable, shaky script, were 3 words. "He knows you now." The message wasn't addressed to his mother or to Daniel Miller. It was addressed to him.
The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The bell, Mortis Dei, the ancient, bone-forged instrument of judgment, was no longer a distant legend. It was personal. It had found him. The truth he had so desperately sought had not merely been revealed, it had reached out and claimed him. The fog outside seemed to press even harder, a suffocating blanket against the ancient stones of St. Bellum. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a chilling premonition that his investigative journey was rapidly nearing a horrifying personal precipice. The 3 words, "He knows you now," burned into Ethan's mind, a fiery brand of terror and dawning comprehension. The church, once a mere backdrop to his investigation, now felt like a predator's lair, its ancient stones humming with an unseen, malevolent presence. Sir Margaret's message wasn't a warning about the bell's power, but a direct, chilling announcement of his own complicity, his own judgment.
But for what? He had no hidden sins, no unatoned debts on his conscience. Or did he? The question, cold and insidious, began to worm its way into his thoughts. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at him. He backed away from the altar, his eyes darting into the deeper shadows of the nave. The silence of the church, once merely unsettling, now felt like a living entity, a vast waiting emptiness. He had to find Sir Margaret. She was the only one who could explain this, who could untangle the sudden, horrifying turn of events. He called out her name again, his voice cracking with a fear he hadn't known he possessed. Only the echo answered him, a mocking whisper from the dark corners. He searched the church frantically, his journalistic composure completely shattered. Every creak of the old timbers, every gust of wind rattling the stained glass windows, sent a jolt of terror through him.
He checked the sacristy, the confessionals, even the dusty, unused choir loft, his heart hammering against his ribs. She was gone, vanished into the impenetrable fog of Grey Hollow, leaving only a cryptic, damning message in her wake. Defeated, shaken, and utterly alone, Ethan stumbled out of the church, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind him with a resonant thud that might break it through the very ground. The fog outside was thicker than ever, a swirling, soupy mass that swallowed all light and sound. He could barely see his hand in front of his face. His car, parked just meters away, was a vague, amorphous shape, barely discernible through the milky veil. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped them. He yanked open the car door, desperate to escape the oppressive silence of church, the suffocating presence of the fog. He started the engine, the sudden roar of the motor a welcome albeit jarring sound in the profound quiet.
He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He drove slowly, painstakingly, through the labyrinthine streets of Grey Hollow, the headlights barely penetrating the dense mist. His mind raced, replaying Sir Margaret's words, his mother's journal, the chilling legend of Mortis Dei. He knows you now. It implied a personal connection, a recognition. But why him? He was an outsider, a disbeliever. He was merely investigating. Then a sudden horrifying thought pierced the fog of his fear. The newspaper clipping, Daniel Mueller. His mother had confessed her indirect role, her hidden guilt through that note. But what about him? He, Ethan Cole, the tenacious reporter, the man of facts, had just spent days delving into his mother's secret, exposing her deepest unatoned sin. Had that act in itself been a transgression? Had he, in his relentless pursuit of truth, unwittingly committed a sin against the memory of the dead, against the sanctity of his mother's final peace?
The possibility was a fresh wave of ice-cold dread. He hadn't caused Daniel Miller's death,
but he had, with clinical detachment, unearthed his mother's indirect responsibility, stripping away the veil of her carefully constructed peace. Had that been enough to draw the attention of Mortis Dei, to be seen? He arrived back at his mother's house, parking haphazardly in the driveway. The house, once a sanctuary from the chilling outside world, now felt vulnerable, exposed. He rushed inside, locking the door behind him with a frantic click. He turned on every light, banishing the shadows, seeking comfort in the mundane glow. He poured himself a strong drink, his hands still trembling as he lifted the glass to his lips. He needed to think, to rationalize, to find a loophole in this terrifying logic. He, a man of science, was being dragged into a supernatural nightmare, one that defied every belief he held dear.
He sat in the living room, the newspaper clipping about Daniel Miller still clutched in his hand. He stared at the faded photo of the boy, his innocent, smiling face. He had felt no guilt, no remorse, only the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, a truth uncovered. Was that his sin? His detachment? His intellectual arrogance? The house was silent again, save for the rhythmic tick of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. He watched the minute hand slowly crawl past the 12, then the 1. His heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The time, the legend, the bell only rang in the dead of night, usually between 2:17 and 2:20 a.m. He looked at his watch, 2:10 a.m. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He tried to tell himself it was just paranoia, the power of suggestion, the lingering effects of a stressful day. He was an atheist. He didn't believe in bells that confirmed judgment, or in bells cast from human bones, or in cosmic arbitrators of sin.
It was all a myth, a collective delusion. He repeated the words in his head, a desperate mantra against the encroaching terror. 2:15 a.m. He closed his eyes, squeezing them shut, trying to block out the oppressive silence, the heavy atmosphere, the insidious whisper of fear. He concentrated on his breathing, trying to calm his racing pulse. It was just a story, just a story. Then, at precisely 2:17 a.m., it came. A sound so profound, so utterly out of place, so impossibly clear, that it pierced through the thick fog, through the walls of the house, through the very fabric of his rational mind. It was a low, resonant hum, a deep, mournful toll that vibrated through the air, through the floorboards, through his bones. Dong. His eyes flew open. He bolted upright in his chair, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't loud, not jarring. It was subtle, yet undeniable. A sound that shouldn't exist. A sound that had been silenced for 40 years. He heard it again. Dong.
It was the St. Bellum bell, and he, Ethan Cole, standing 3 kilometers away from the church, a skeptic to his core, had heard it, clear as a whisper in a silent room. He scrambled to the window, peering out into the impenetrable white fog, as if expecting to see the spectral bell tower glowing in the distance. He saw nothing but the swirling mist. Dong. 3 tolls. The legend confirmed. The clock in the hallway chimed 2:20 a.m. Then silence. A silence more profound, more terrifying than anything he had ever experienced.
The bell had rung for him. He had been seen. The dread was no longer a chill, but an icy fist clutching his heart. He was judged. And if the legend held true, he had only 7 days left. The investigative reporter had found his most terrifying personal story yet, a story of his own impending demise. The silence after the third chilling toll was absolute, a void that swallowed all sound, all hope.
Ethan stood transfixed by the window, staring into the impenetrable white canvas of the fog, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He had heard it, not a whisper, not a trick of the mind, but a clear, resonant peal that had vibrated through the very core of his being. The St. Bellum bell, for him, the heart-bitten atheist, the relentless truth-seeker, was now utterly, terrifyingly convinced. He backed away from the window, stumbling over a forgotten rug, his legs feeling like jelly. The cold dread that had been a creeping chill was now an icy torrent, flooding his veins. 7 days, that was the legend. 7 days until death claimed him, just as it had claimed his mother and countless others before them. His mind, usually sharp and analytical, spun in a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. This couldn't be happening, not to him. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy with fear. He had to call someone, anyone. The police. What would he say?
I heard a ghost bell, and now I'm going to die. They'd think he'd lost his mind, a victim of Grey Hollow's collective madness. His editor, a seasoned journalist, suddenly believing in a supernatural death omen? His career would be over, replaced by a straitjacket and a padded room. He sank onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. He tried to rationalize, to find a logical explanation, a scientific debunking. But the memory of the bell's unmistakable toll, the very vibration in his chest, defied all reason. It had been real. Hours passed in a blur of terror and self-recrimination. He thought of his mother, her final days consumed by a fear he had dismissed as delusion. How wrong he had been, how cruelly arrogant. Had he truly caused death by unearthing her secret? Or was it something else, something deeper, a hidden flaw in his own character that Mortis Day had seen?
His journalistic pursuit had been relentless, often disregarding the emotional toll on those he investigated. Was that his sin? His cold, detached pursuit of truth, regardless of the consequences for the living or the dead. As the first anemic light of dawn began to seep through the fog-laden windows, Ethan felt a flicker of grim resolve ignite within him. If he had only 7 days, he wouldn't spend them cowering in fear. He was a reporter. He would investigate his own demise. He would go to the source, to the bell tower, and confront whatever ancient evil lay within. If this was his judgment, he would face it head-on. He dressed quickly, his movements stiff, almost robotic. He grabbed his flashlight, a sturdy multi-tool, and the old newspaper clipping about Daniel Miller. He didn't know what he'd find, but he knew he couldn't simply wait for death to claim him. The fog was still thick, clinging to every surface, but the town was stirring.
A few early risers were already making their way to the general store, their forms mere specters in the mist. He wondered if they had heard it. The legend said not everyone could hear the bell. He remembered Sir Margaret's eyes, her knowing gaze. Had she known he would hear it? He drove to St. Bellum, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and grim determination.
The church loomed out of the fog, a dark, silent guardian. He tried the main doors, still locked. He tried the side door he'd found yesterday, also locked. Panic flared again. Was the bell tower now sealed against him? He circled the church, searching desperately, his eyes scanning every stone, every window. Then he noticed a faint glimmer of light near the back, by the old rectory connected to the church. A small, almost invisible door was ajar, barely a crack. He pushed it open, slipping inside. He found himself in a narrow, musty hallway leading to a winding stone staircase. This had to be it.
The way up to the bell tower. The air grew colder, denser, imbued with the scent of damp stone, and something else, something metallic and ancient. He began to ascend, his flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. Each step echoed ominously in the profound silence. The staircase spiraled upwards, seemingly endless. The walls were rough-hewn stone, clammy to the touch. He climbed, his muscles aching, his breath growing ragged. He passed a small landing, then another, the air growing colder, thinner, filled with an oppressive sense of history. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached a heavy oak door, banded with rusted iron. It was partially open, a sliver of darkness visible beyond. He pushed it further, the ancient wood groaning in protest. He stepped into the bell tower. The space was vast, circular, and incredibly cold. High above, almost lost in the oppressive darkness, hung the massive, silent form of Mortis Dei.
It was larger than he had imagined, a hulking bronze behemoth, dark and forbidding. The air was thick with dust and the lingering scent of old rust, and something else, something coppery and metallic. He shone his flashlight up towards the bell. He could see the severed ropes, frayed and brittle, hanging like dead vines. The mechanism was indeed sealed, a heavy iron cage encasing the clapper. No physical way for the bell to ring, yet it had. He moved closer, his gaze fixed on the base of the bell. Then he saw it. A dark, viscous liquid was slowly dripping from the bell's underside, gathering in a small, reddish-black puddle on the stone floor beneath. It wasn't rust. It was the same substance Mr. Abernathy had described, the same chilling stain from 1979. It was blood, thick, dark, congealed. A wave of nausea washed over him. He staggered back, his mind refusing to process the horrifying sight. A bell that bled. It was impossible.
Yet there it was, an undeniable, gruesome reality. He forced himself to look up again, shining his flashlight directly onto the surface of the bell. He moved the beam slowly, meticulously, around its circumference, searching for any anomaly, any clue. And then he found it. On the inner surface of the bell, near the bottom edge, etched into the dark metal as if carved by an unseen hand, were two words: fresh, raw, still gleaming with the dark, wet sheen of recent work. Ethan Cole, his name,
carved into the very heart of Mortis Dei. He gasped, a guttural sound of pure terror. The bell hadn't just confirmed his judgment, it had claimed him, inscribed his name onto its very being. The truth was worse, far worse than any legend. He wasn't merely going to die in 7 days. His soul had already been marked, his fate irrevocably sealed. The fog outside had cleared just enough for him to see the brutal reality of his own judgment, inscribed on the flesh and bone of Mortis Dei itself.
His 7 days had begun. The carved inscription of his name, Ethan Cole, on the inner surface of Mortis Dei, fresh and glistening with something that looked suspiciously like the blood dripping from the bell, stole the air from Ethan's lungs. He stumbled back, hitting the cold stone wall of the tower, the metallic tang of the air suddenly overwhelming. His rational mind, what little was left of it, screamed in protest, demanding an explanation, a trick of the light, anything but this horrifying, undeniable reality. But the terror in his gut, the primal fear that now consumed him, knew better. His name, carved by something unseen, yet terrifyingly real. He touched the cold, damp stone, trying to ground himself, but his hands trembled uncontrollably. The bleeding bell, the impossible carving, the chilling confirmation of his judgment, it was all too much.
Hey, Ethan Cole, the man who dissected truth with surgical precision, was now utterly, hopelessly lost in a nightmare beyond comprehension. The 7 days, they weren't a countdown to a mysterious death. They were the aftermath of a verdict already passed. He spent what felt like an eternity in that desolate bell tower, staring at his name etched into the heart of the abyss. The cold seeped into his bones, but it was the cold of terror, not just the raw stone. He touched the inscription, a morbid compulsion overriding his fear, and felt a strange, chilling warmth beneath his fingertips, not the cold metal he expected. It was as if the bell itself was alive, pulsating with an ancient, malevolent energy. He eventually stumbled down the winding staircase, his legs weak, his mind a chaotic mess of dread and despair. He emerged from the church, blinking in the still, muted light of the fog-laden morning.
The town looked the same, ordinary, oblivious to the terrifying secret held within its ancient church. He felt utterly alone, isolated by a truth no one else could or would believe. The following 6 days were a blur. Ethan moved through them like a ghost, an observer of his own slow, inevitable march towards an unknown end. He ate little, slept less, the image of his name on the bell a constant, haunting presence in his mind. He tried to research, to find any historical precedent for bleeding bells or self-carving inscriptions, but his efforts were futile. The internet offered only folklore and urban legends, nothing to explain the impossible reality he faced. He visited his mother's grave, a newly turned mound of earth still awaiting its permanent headstone. He knelt there, the damp grass cold beneath his knees, and whispered an apology, a plea for forgiveness for his journalistic intrusion, for his blindness, for his skepticism.
He didn't know if she could hear him, or if his apology would even matter. Mortis Dei had already spoken. He also returned to the church, but found the side door and all other entrances once again sealed. It was as if the tower had granted him a single, horrifying audience, and now dismissed him,
leaving him to await his fate outside its ancient walls. He never saw Sir Margaret again. She too, it seemed, had vanished into the quiet oblivion of Grey Hollow, leaving him with her final, damning words. He knows you now. As the 6th day bled into the 7th, the fog in Grey Hollow seemed to thicken even further, becoming a palpable presence that pressed down on the entire town. Ethan sat in his mother's living room, lights blazing, the grandfather clock ticking relentlessly towards 2:17 a.m. This was it. The end. He felt a strange calm, an eerie resignation. The terror had given way to a profound weariness, a quiet acceptance of the inevitable.
He had fought against Grey Hollow's shadows, only to be swallowed by them. He closed his eyes, listening to the relentless tick-tock, counting down the seconds to his own judgment. He thought of his life, his career, his relationships, all the things he would leave behind. He thought of his mother, and the quiet dignity with which she had faced her own end, unaware, perhaps, of the true, horrifying nature of the bell's call. He only hoped his passing would be as peaceful, as swift. The clock chimed 2:17 a.m. He held his breath, straining his ears, not daring to move. The silence was absolute, suffocating. He waited. 1 second. 2. 10. A minute. He heard nothing. No low hum. No resonant toll. No impossible chime. Nothing. Had it been a reprieve? A mistake? Had the bell somehow chosen to spare him? A flicker of hope, fragile and tentative, ignited in his chest. Then, precisely at 2:18 a.m., the silence was shattered.
The sound that erupted from St. Bellum was unlike anything heard before. Not 3 tolls, but a continuous, mournful peal that echoed through the entire town, a reverberating lament that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of Grey Hollow. Dong, dong, dong. Not just 3 times, but over and over, a relentless, sorrowful clangor that tore through the fog, through the quiet, through the very fabric of the night. And this time, everyone heard it. Every light in Grey Hollow flickered on. Dogs began to howl, a mournful chorus. People